Today we are going to be discussing how to incorporate quotations in your paper. So this is specifically to paper number 2, which of course you are recommending a reading to a targeted audience. And in my case, I am recommending Anne Lamott's Shitty First Drafts to beginning students in 1010 English. And notice that's very specific, right? The more specific you make your audience, the better. To that end, I will read your paper ideas as well as your thesis and supporting topic sentences today and tomorrow, and we'll get those back to you by Tuesday at the latest so you can start your first drafts. And I'm switching up the schedule just a tiny bit. I'm going to give you an extra week to work on your second drafts. I want you to take the time. I noticed particularly on paper 1, I could really tell the people who put the time into their second drafts, and the difference was night and day. So I really want to encourage you. And again, we'll be doing peer reviews this time for this paper. And peer reviews, the reason we do that is also very helpful. Not only are you helping out your peer by reading their paper, but it's helpful for you to understand the elements that need to be in your essay. So again, I'll be moving back that deadline to the first Sunday in August for your what month am I? October for your final, and I will make that clear on the assignment sheet. So also I want to note that this paper number 2, will be in the third person, and third person is they, them, the reader, the writer, etc., as opposed to the first person, I, me, that you did in your first paper. So from this point forward, we'll be writing only in the third person. Also, a note about MLA style. Some of you did not format your papers in MLA style, and that's an easy 5 points if you do it right. And also, it's so easy, guys, to do so. I put a video in this week's module that isn't mine, but I think it's probably one of the more effective explanations of how to incorporate quotes with MLA. That's MLA. I cannot say that. MLA style. He just goes through it and breaks it down so simply, and I just find it very effective, and it's short and simple. So I included that as well. I'll go over some of those aspects today in this video, but again, if you want just kind of the boiled down version of how to do internal quotes, check out that video. And also, our textbooks are an absolute great resource for MLA citations. If you look in the back, it breaks down pretty much any type of document you'll be citing. So really look that over, and also shows you ways to incorporate, which again, we'll go over in this video. But use that textbook. Also, if you have any questions, ask me, ask the Writing Center. You've got lots of resources at your disposal. All right, let's talk incorporating quotes. I think the biggest takeaway for when you're incorporating quotes, and again, you'll be doing that in this paper because you'll be using textual evidence from the essay to explain your thesis. So you can't just say, I recommend it to this group because I think it will teach valuable lessons. You have to extract specific examples from the reading to show me what you mean and how that supports your point. Remember that supporting documentation is absolutely necessary to prove your point. Okay, so one thing, let's look at when you should quote. You want to use quotes at strategic points. So if you introduce a topic, you want them to support that with the textual element from the reading. Let's look at ways to do that. And another big takeaway is don't just incorporate that quote. You need to explain the relevance of that quote. So you can't just put the quote in there and expect your reader to know what the heck it means. You have to set it up, and you have to describe how that supports your point. So the quote itself is not enough. And do not list multiple quotes in a row and expect the reader to understand. You have to set up that quote both before and after to explain its significance. So let's look at one way to do so. And that means providing the context for it, right? So as I said, you can't just pop it in there and explain, okay, this is why. And you also have to introduce the speaker who is saying that quote. So let's look at one way you can introduce a quote. So in Shitty First Drafts, Lamont talks about how very good writers write a first draft which is not elegant. So notice I introduce the quote. And then she says, I actually follow with the quote. I know some very great writers you love who write beautifully and have not made a great deal of money, and not one of them sits down routinely feeling wildly enthusiastic and confident. Not one of them writes an elegant first draft. And note that I introduced the quote. So a couple things here. I introduced the quote with a colon. So I have set up that quote. And then also I have already introduced that the writer is Lamont. So in my citation, I do not have to then relist the author's name because I've already done so in my introduction to that quote. So it's okay to use the page number. And if you're using the page number, if you are using Shitty First Draft, there's only 2 pages because it's excerpted from a book. So it's just page 1 and page 2. And in the second example, it's the same thing without the Lamont. So I just say the author. So at the end in the citation, you then have to list the Lamont. Notice a couple things. Notice where the period is here. It's after the citation. And notice there's no period after the quote itself. So another thing is you have to attribute that quote to its source. So you have to tell me who is saying. And this is, I'm a big read aloud to find out mistakes. So that's another good test. If you read that your quote aloud, would your reader be able to tell who is speaking? And remember, when you're writing, you always have to think about your reader. That's your responsibility to make sure that your reader understands the context, understands your point. So if your reader can't understand who's speaking, then you've got a problem. And you could say, one way to introduce it is to say they said, the author said. That's fine. I don't get bored of that, quite frankly, but if you want other options for attribution, you could say Lamont notes that writers, Lamont remarks, announces, states. I'm giving you a list here so you can kind of get some different options if you get tired of the said. Sometimes you want to do, if some of these are really good, if they are arguing or complaining or proclaiming or opining in the case if it's their opinion. And you only use opinions when it's from an expert, right? Because we're documentation and we're stating facts. And again, we talked about explaining the significance of the quotation. So once you've inserted the quote, attributed it, provided context, you also have to explain in your own words, in third person, why that quote matters and how it backs up or supports your main thesis. So in this case, I just say with that, and this is going back to the quote I just used above for that example, and here's where I'm explaining it. I say, with that message, that writing is a struggle. Beginning writers can take solace knowing that even the pros struggle. This revelation is no doubt helpful for those just learning to write. And again, that's just explaining why I think this particular essay is great for beginning writers. So let's look at ways to physically embed the quote within the sentence. So we talked about one option above where you use the colons. So here is that. So the colon then announces the quote. You can also directly attribute it to the speaker. So here we say, and then you remember you need a comma after your attribution. Attribution is the saids, the claims, the states. Those are the words that are introduced. We call it the attribution. So Lamont describes how it took her years to trust the process. She states, so I'd start writing without reining myself in. And because I said she states, it's not clear it is Lamont. So again, I list Lamont's name in the attribution. And if the MLA citation. And if I did say Lamont states, then of course I would just use the page number. You can also, another way is to introduce, we call it the interruption. And that just means you put your author's name in the middle of the quote. You break up that quote in some strategic spot. And that sometimes it's just you want to do that because you want to emphasize the point. Sometimes you want to vary your sentence structure. So this is how you do that. You just quote it like you would. For me and most of the writers I know, and notice there's a comma, quotations, and the punctuation always goes in the quotes in MLA. So for me and most writers I know, Lamont explains, writing is not rapturous. And again, because I have Lamont in the quote itself, I do not have to cite it, her name at the end, just the page number. But notice a couple things. So the first comma before the attribution, and then also because it's in the middle of a quote, because it's in the middle of a quote, you just use a comma and continue the quote. So basically I've interrupted the sentence. So it's one complete sentence. So there's no need to capitalize writing because I did not use a period. So if I did break that, if it were actually two quotes, then I would do Lamont explains, period, writing is not rapturous, and writing would be capitalized. But again, because it's one quote or one sentence, and I broke it up in the middle, this is how you would punctuate that. Another big question is how much should you quote? So my basic rule of thumb is less is more. Pick the quote or one or two sentences or words that make your point. You don't need 4 sentences if one sentence from the text actually is what's making your point, right? You don't want to clog down your writing with a big, huge amount of text because it's not necessary. Think about what words and what the quotes are necessary to make your point. So keep it as spare as possible. Also, block quotes. And by block quote, that just means piling one quote after the other on top of each other in one paragraph. That really, really bogs it down. And unless that's absolutely necessary, which it will seldom be necessary, but unless it's necessary, do not do that. Stagger your quotes. Make sure you explain what the relevance is. Follow up by explaining after the quote why it makes your point, right? And again, it's all in third person, so it's Lamont explains, the reader therefore would understand this to be, etc. It's not I. And I know that's hard because you're writing, it's your opinion. So if you do slip some I's in there, that's what first drafts are for. That's so easily corrected to turn those I's into a third person. So don't worry about that. Get your draft down. And again, writing is a process. So that first draft is where you get, as Lamont says, where you get all your ideas out on the page. And then you go back, the hard work of crafting your essay. So first drafts, get started on those this week. Again, you'll be turning those in on Sunday. And from there, you'll do a peer review. And from there, you'll revise again. So you're going to have plenty of time to revise to make these papers as good as possible. Okay, that's it. Thanks, guys.